Have you ever seen a legend cry? Not just any person, not an athlete just starting out or someone who lost everything, but a champion, a symbol, a national hero, one of the greatest names in Formula One of all time. Yes, we're talking about Ayrton Senna, the man who seemed invincible until that day, that moment, that instant when, in front of the entire world, he broke down and cried. But why did he cry? What happened there, on top of that podium at the 1991 Brazilian GP, that made the most ruthless driver on the grid break down like a boy? What could break someone who had always been the definition of control, technique, and coolness at high speed? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover now may surprise you. Senna was more than a driver. He was an icon. For millions of Brazilians, he was a mixture of hope, pride, and redemption in the midst of a country immersed in political, economic, and social crises. On Sunday mornings, when the green flag waved and the sound of engines filled the TV, Brazil stopped. Because there, in that red and white McLaren, was someone who represented what we all wanted to be: resilient, brilliant, winners. But behind the helmet, there was a human being. And this human being carried a gigantic weight. Not only the weight of winning races, but of supporting an entire nation with his results. The Brazilian GP was always a separate chapter in Senna's career. A home race, crazy fans, high expectations. It was the 7th time he had tried to win on Brazilian soil, and until then, every attempt had failed due to a detail, a mistake, a touch, a breakdown. On that March 24th, 1991, in Interlagos, Senna had a mission: to win. It wasn't just for him. It was for everyone. It was because of the kid on the outskirts who woke up early just to see him run. For the worker who saw in his victories a reason to smile in a difficult country. For the child who dreamed of being a driver and thought anything was possible when Senna was on the track. The start was perfect. Absolute dominance. But Formula One, like life, never delivers victories without a fight. Lap after lap, problems began to appear. First, he lost 4th gear, then 3rd. Soon, only 6th gear remained. The McLaren became almost impossible to drive, even more so on technical curves and when picking up speed. His muscles trembled, his arms barely responded. The radio urged, "Hang in there, Senna. Not long now." Now imagine, you are leading one of the toughest races of your life in your home country with everyone watching. Your body is at its limit. Your car is almost unusable, and yet, you can't stop. You don't want to stop. You won't stop. Because more than championship points, what was at stake here was your heart, your story, your truth. It is at this moment that the myth shows that it is human, and it is precisely at this point that the human becomes a legend. Have you ever been there? A moment when everything seemed to be against you, but you kept going anyway? Not because it was easy, but because giving up was not an option. That's exactly what happened to Senna that day. When he crossed the finish line, it wasn't a normal celebration. There were no big gestures or shouts. He could barely move his arms. He nearly passed out in the cockpit. He needed help to get out of the car. And on the podium, finally, came what he had been holding back for so long. Tears. A deep cry, cathartic, painful, and liberating at the same time. And there, before an ecstatic crowd, the hero showed that even giants cry. That there is no glory without pain, that there is no true victory without total surrender. What did he say afterwards? How did he explain that moment? What was the real impact of that race on his life and on the way the world came to see Ayrton Senna? These are questions that still echo among fans, journalists, and Formula One enthusiasts. And the answer, well, the answer is starting to emerge. Now, because Senna's tears on that podium weren't just a personal outburst, they were a mirror that many of us recognize. That moment crossed the boundaries of sport. It touched those who have faced silent exhaustion, who have carried the world on their shoulders and still smiled so that no one would notice. It was the pain of winning from within, even when everything outside of you seems to want to stop you. Maybe you've already experienced something like this. A moment when no one saw the effort you put in, the sacrifices you made, how much it hurt to stay strong until the end. If this topic resonates with you, leave here in the comments what touched you the most so far. Your story can inspire others who are also fighting their own races. And honestly, I read every comment carefully because this channel is not just about videos. It's about people, about feelings, about truth. If you liked this content so far, click like right now. It may seem like a small detail, but it makes all the difference. This is how YouTube understands that this video deserves to be shown to more people. People who may need exactly this message today. And if this type of story captivates you, if you want to continue reliving memorable moments in Formula One with depth, emotion, and respect for the history of the great names on the tracks, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell. That way you don't miss the next chapters that are coming. Because every time we go back in time here, it's not just to remember, it's to feel again. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. It's the fuel that moves all of this forward. So comment, like, subscribe, and follow me, because now we'll understand what really happened behind that podium. What Senna revealed after the checkered flag, what he carried inside his heart that day. 91. It was the 7th time that Ayrton Senna raced in the Brazilian Grand Prix, dreaming of winning at home. 7 times, 7 attempts. For any other driver, this might have been just a number, a statistic, another line on his resume. But for him, it was different. Very different. Because Senna was not just another name on the grid. He was the reflection of an entire country. At that time, Brazil was facing a turbulent scenario. Out of control, inflation, political instability, distrust in institutions, and a population tired of empty promises. In the midst of all this, Senna emerged as a kind of exception to the rule. A Brazilian who was winning abroad, who stood out among the best in the world with discipline, focus, talent, and a relentless mentality. While the country seemed to be going in circles, he was moving in a straight line, always ahead, and that's when everything starts to get a little more difficult. Because the more he won, the more he was put on a pedestal, not just as a driver, but as a symbol, a representative of everything Brazilians wanted to be and couldn't. It wasn't just about racing, it was about dignity, about self-esteem, about a sense of national identity that relied on him like a thread of hope. The press didn't make things easy. Every race at Interlagos was surrounded by suffocating coverage. Inflamed headlines, sky-high expectations, technical comments that seemed more like disguised psychological pressure. And the fans loved it. Intensely, viscerally, almost mystically. But love, when loaded with expectation, can also become a burden. And what a burden. Senna felt all of this. Absorbed, silently. He was never one to complain. He wasn't one to expose himself. He always maintained that reserved, focused, almost cold posture. But behind the firm expression, there was a whirlwind that few people saw. Because what was shown to the world was the warrior, the strategist, the master of rain. But behind the scenes, there was the human being. Someone who also had doubts, fears, internal pressures that often don't fit inside an interview room. And what few people understand, and this is perhaps the most delicate point, is that Formula One is not just about technique. It is not just about machines. It is not just about strategy. It is, above all, a field of human decisions at very high speed, where every choice made in milliseconds can cost everything. Senna understood this like few others, and perhaps for this very reason, he treated each race as a personal battle, an affirmation of identity, a test of value. Behind the scenes at the start of the 1991 season, there was a tense atmosphere. He was already a 2-time world champion. He had already won on legendary tracks. He was already respected by the likes of Prost, Mansell, and Piquet. But there was still something left to do. Win in Brazil, at home, in front of his people. And do it not out of vanity, but because it meant something. It was as if a piece was missing from the puzzle of his own narrative. A victory at Interlagos would be more than just a sporting achievement. It would be a kind of collective catharsis. During training, everything seemed to fall into place. The car was responding well, the team was aligned, and Senna was visibly focused. But it was no ordinary gathering. It was as if he carried something extra. A kind of silent tension that can be seen in his gaze, in the restrained way he walked around the paddock, in the way he sat in the cockpit, with the calm of someone meditating and the firmness of someone going to war. And it is important to understand what this race meant emotionally to him. It was not just the technical challenge of driving a Formula One car for more than 70 laps in the scorching heat of São Paulo. It was the internal challenge of living up to an almost inhuman expectation. Because on that track, he was not just Ayrton Senna. He was the mirror of 150 million Brazilians who wanted to believe that, yes, it was possible to win with honesty, excellence, and courage. In that cockpit, Senna carried more than a car. He carried 150 million people. This phrase may seem exaggerated to outsiders, but those who lived through that time know. They know how much he meant on Sunday mornings. They know the impact that his victory had on Monday morning conversations. Senna was emotional fuel for an entire people. He was encouragement. He was pride. He was a breath of fresh air in the midst of chaos. And the most curious thing is that, even with all this invisible responsibility, he kept moving forward, always moving forward. He never used it as an excuse. He never backed down. But every time he entered Interlagos, there was an open wound, the fact that he had never managed to win there. Something always went wrong. A touch, an engine, a breakdown. The feeling that there was something holding him back, as if that track tested his deepest limits year after year. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Because what happened in that 1991 race was much more than just a series of high-speed laps. It was a physical, emotional, and symbolic journey that took Senna to his limit. And understanding that limit, and what he did with it, is essential to understanding not only the driver, but the man behind the helmet. Comment below. This makes sense to me. I want to know if this part of the story also touches you in some way. The start was clean. Senna, as always, jumped with surgical precision. No mistakes, no hesitation, just focus. He took the lead with authority, as if he were telling the world, "No one can take this away from me today." And for a long time, it really did seem like the day would follow a calm, predictable path. But of course, with Senna, nothing was that simple. The sun was scorching Interlagos. It was one of those Sundays when the heat seems to want to melt everything, asphalt, cars, muscles. But Senna kept up the pace, fast laps, steady car, absolute control. While his opponents fought back there, he seemed to be on another frequency, in an almost meditative state. Each curve was designed with millimetric precision, each braking at the limit of perfection. It was the pinnacle of a pilot who no longer guided with just his hands. He guided with instinct, with his entire body, as if he were fused to the machine. But Formula One, like life, loves to test who is at the top. And in that race, the tests started arriving one by one, as if someone up there had decided to put Senna to the test once again. The first gear to fail was fourth. A subtle problem, difficult to notice for those watching, but one that forced the driver to adapt his driving in real time. A few laps later, third gear also failed, and it wasn't long before second gear showed signs that it couldn't hold out much longer. It was as if the car was falling apart while it was in the lead, and Senna, inside it, had to reinvent himself with each lap. If you've ever driven a manual car, you can imagine what it's like to be limited to a single gear. Now, imagine doing that at over 250 km/h on high-speed curves, braking hard, with other drivers right behind you, and the whole world watching. Senna started driving practically only in sixth gear, and this wasn't just a technical difficulty. It was a physical challenge. Each curve required absurd arm strength. The car's torque became almost uncontrollable. The lack of shorter gears compromised the entire acceleration strategy. The steering was heavy. His shoulders were in spasms. His hands were almost numb. He could barely hold the steering wheel at times, and yet he kept going. It is at this point that the myth transforms into something even rarer, a human being in a state of absolute overcoming. Because any experienced pilot faced with that situation would have accepted abandonment. He would have taken the car back to the pits and avoided further damage. But Senna had made a decision. He would go all the way. Not because he was stubborn, but because there was something about that race that went beyond the result. It was about facing your own limit and crossing it. And as the race progressed, the gap between him and the second-place driver decreased. At that point, Mansell was pushing hard, but Senna was not giving in. Every lap was an internal battle. He was not just competing with the other cars, he was fighting against the pain, against fatigue, against his own body, which was already showing signs of collapse. There are times when a human being connects with something greater, a type of strength that does not come from the physical, nor from technique. It comes from conviction, from total dedication, from what many call purpose. And there, in Interlagos, Senna was driven by this motivation that cannot be explained with telemetry or data analysis. It was something that pulsed inside. The race broadcast began to notice that something was wrong. Commentators noted that Senna was slower on the straights and hesitant on corner exits, but still leading, holding on tightly to a victory that seemed to slip away with every passing meter. And even with the obvious limitations, even with the lame car, no one could overtake it. The image that remained etched in the memory of those who watched was that of a wounded gladiator, still standing, refusing to fall. At every turn, it seemed as if the car was going to go off the track, but it didn't. At every lap, the team radio begged, "Hang on one more, Senna, just one more." And he hung on. Because somehow, he always found strength where there seemed to be none. When the checkered flag came out, no one immediately understood the magnitude of what had happened. Senna crossed the line with a narrow advantage, practically collapsing. In the cockpit, there was no effusive celebration. There were no raised fists, just the heavy silence of someone who had won a war that no one else saw. He stayed there for long seconds, almost motionless. The mechanics had to help him out. His body was shaking. His muscles were locked. His neck was no longer strong enough to support the weight of the helmet. Sweat was pouring down his neck as if he had just finished a marathon. He was a champion, broken, and yet whole. The images from the podium were moving. Senna, in the center, could barely lift the trophy. His right arm was rising with difficulty, his left arm practically inactive. The national anthem played in the background. And then, finally, the tears. The ones he had held back for years, the ones that weren't just his. They were from everyone who understood what was at stake that day. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what happens when a legend breaks? What is revealed when someone who seemed indestructible shows their most fragile side? What is the true impact of a moment like this on a man's trajectory and on the collective imagination of a country? Write in the comments. I'm on this journey too. I want to know who is really feeling this. He remained there, inside the cockpit, with his eyes closed, as if he were trying to maintain consciousness only by controlling his breathing. It was clear that his body was no longer obeying him. His arms were rigid. His neck was hanging to the side. No one there, not even the McLaren engineers, could imagine how much that race had cost. And I'm not talking about fuel or tire wear. I'm talking about vital energy, emotional reserve, total dedication. When they finally managed to help him out of the car, Senna could barely walk. The steps are short, slow, uncoordinated. He needed support, as if he had crossed a desert alone. It was like watching a gladiator who came out of the arena alive, but left part of himself on the ground. The crowd applauded, shouted his name, but he barely reacted. That was no winning pose. It was collapse. A beautiful breakdown. If there is such a thing. Because he was the pure image of what it means to go all the way, even when your body has already asked for a truce long before. On the podium, the most anticipated moment turned into something much more than a celebration. There was no big smile, no exaggerated gestures, Just him, there, with tears in his eyes, trying to maintain his posture. His right arm, with difficulty, lifts the trophy, but his left arm, paralyzed, does not follow. It was an image too symbolic to be ignored. Half of him triumphed, the other half surrendered, and then came the tears. They weren't rehearsed tears. They weren't a marketing gesture or a symbol of vanity. They were raw, silent, visceral tears. Tears that came from years of frustration, from failed attempts at Interlagos, from accumulated pressure, from expectations placed on her shoulders. Tears from someone who had held everything in for so long, until she couldn't hold it in any longer. Those tears were not just of joy. They were of exhaustion, of liberation, of someone who gave everything and still won, of someone who surpassed all limits, physical and emotional, and came out the other side carrying not only a trophy, but proof that the impossible can be tamed when the will is greater than the pain. Have you ever been there? Have you ever had that moment when, even though you were standing, you felt like you were on the verge of collapsing inside? Have you ever felt the weight of having to keep everything under control when all you wanted was to allow yourself to fall, breathe, rest a little? The truth is that this moment of Senna's is not just the climax of a race. It is the reflection of something much greater, an intimate and powerful representation of the human being facing his own barriers. There, on top of the podium, he was all of us, those who fight in silence, those who endure pain that no one sees, those who remain firm on the outside while their soul screams on the inside. At that moment, Senna was not just a driver. He was an emotional mirror, the reflection of every person who has faced an invisible marathon to get to where they are, of every father or mother who needs to appear strong to their children, of every professional who carries more than just his badge, of every young person who wakes up every day to prove that he can be more than what is expected of him. There is a hidden truth in those tears that few dare to face. Winning sometimes hurts. And just because you are winning doesn't mean you are not suffering. The transformation that happens within those who go beyond their own limits is intense, solitary, and often misunderstood. And Senna, there, at the highest point of the podium, taught us exactly that, without saying a word. The impact of this scene has endured through time. Even today, when people talk about Ayrton Senna, this episode comes back with force. Because it breaks through a layer that goes beyond sport, beyond speed, beyond entertainment. It touches on something essential, the recognition that being strong also means knowing when to let your emotions come to the surface. That there is courage in showing weakness. That there is greatness in admitting that it was difficult, but that you did it anyway. That cry revealed a human side that the world had never seen before. A side that inspired millions, not because of its perfection, but because of its truth, because of its vulnerability, because of its unconditional commitment. And that is why this victory is considered one of the most emotional in the history of Formula One, not only because of what happened on the track, but because of what happened inside that man. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because behind this moment there is an even more intense story, which few know about. A series of behind-the-scenes events, risky decisions and revelations about what really happened in the minutes after the race. And it is at this point that we begin to understand not only the impact of this victory, but how it transformed Senna's mindset, and perhaps that of an entire generation that found themselves there, crying with him. Comment: this makes sense to me. I want to know if you have also experienced moments like this, and if this story touches you in any way. The image of Ayrton Senna crying on the podium that day was not only etched in Formula One records, it permeated the sport. It entered living rooms, conversations between friends, and the silent thoughts of those watching at home with teary eyes, without understanding exactly why. It was as if, for a few seconds, the entire world had stopped to watch a man break down, and at the same time, rebuild himself right there, in front of everyone. Senna's tears at that moment did not make him any lesser. On the contrary, it was exactly there that he became more than a driver, more than an idol. He became real. That moment, which could have been seen as weakness, revealed a strength that few can access, the ability to continue when everything inside them is asking them to stop, the ability to resist even when pain imposes itself, the ability to not hide emotions when they overflow. It's easy to admire someone when they win easily. When you cross the finish line with a perfect car, a healthy body, a flawless day. But what happened in Interlagos in 1991 was a lesson of a different nature. It was about the truth that exists at the edge, about what happens when talent meets adversity, and the only way out is surrender. Total. No guarantees. No reservations. It was also one of the rare times that Brazil saw its greatest sporting figure stripped of his armor. There was no confident posture, no measured speech, no unperturbed expression. What there was a human being who fought until the end, and in the end, cried. Not just because he won, but because he survived something that no one else saw. Because no one but him truly felt what was at stake. And the most beautiful thing is realizing how this moment affected people. Many who never cared about motor racing began to respect Senna for that gesture, because therein lay the essence of true vulnerability, the kind that makes no apologies for existing, that doesn't need to be hidden, that doesn't fear being misunderstood, the vulnerability that carries courage, and that, for that very reason, inspires. If even Ayrton Senna had his moment of weakness, perhaps it is time for us to look at our own limits with more respect. Perhaps the strength that matters most is not the one of never falling, but of having the courage to feel everything that comes when we choose not to give up. Sometimes moving on is the most rebellious and powerful act someone can commit. And that says a lot about how Senna's public image was shaped from then on. Because from that moment on, people no longer saw just the brilliant driver. They saw the man who endured it all with his heart in his hand, who faced internal and external battles with the same intensity, who was as brilliant as he was human, and perhaps precisely for that reason, so unforgettable. Behind the scenes, this victory also had consequences that many people are unaware of. It changed the way he dealt with his own journey. It changed his relationship with Brazil, with the fans, with the pain. From that moment on, something seemed to have been unlocked internally, as if that victory had completed an emotional cycle that had been building for years. The victory at Interlagos was the turning point, not only because of the achievement, but because of what it represented in terms of personal transformation. Senna continued to win after that, of course, but there was something different in his demeanor. More serenity, perhaps. More presence. As if, by facing his own limits so closely, he had rediscovered what really mattered, on and off the track. And here comes one of the most valuable lessons of this story. The true legacy of a champion is not only in the trophies he accumulates, but in the marks he leaves on others, in what he awakens, in what he transforms. And Senna transformed a lot that day. He inspired not only by winning, but by winning with everything against him. For having shown that being truly strong is not about not feeling, it is about continuing to feel everything. This kind of strength is not taught in school, it is not trained in a simulator, it is not bought with sponsorship. It comes from within. It comes from the truth of who you are when no one is looking. And that is why this scene has been so memorable. Because all of us, at some point in our lives, have been on that invisible podium, trying to maintain our posture, while something inside us screamed for relief. We learn from an early age that showing fragility is dangerous, that too much emotion is a sign of weakness. But Senna reversed this code with a simple gesture, crying, without shame, without fear, and perhaps without even knowing how much it would affect people. Sometimes, the greatest transformation begins with a simple, but honest, gesture. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there is a layer that is rarely talked about. The psychological impact that this race had not only on Senna, but on the entire Formula One universe. A new perception about the limits of the body, the mind, and resilience, and how this shaped not only his legacy, but also the way we understand what it means to be a true champion. Comment: this makes sense to me. I want to know if this story also made you look at your own battles in a different way. If you've come this far, it's because this story touched you in some way. Maybe it reminded you of a difficult time you faced, or you simply recognized something that lives inside you on this journey. And if this type of content makes sense to you, if these reflections on strength, truth, and humanity do you good in some way, it's worth being here with us. Subscribe to the channel to continue following stories like this one. It's not just about Formula One, it's about people. About everything we feel, experience, and learn along the way. And of course, like this video, if at any point you felt connected to what was said, this really helps to get this message to more people who, like you, are on the same search for meaning, for real inspiration. And before you go, write here in the comments, "I'm with you until the end." That way I will know that you came until the last second of this journey. And truly, it is an honor to share this space with those who feel this way, with an open heart. There is a video here that complements this subject and further delves into this look behind the scenes of great stories. Click and continue with me there. The conversation is just beginning.